Good afternoon, distinguished guests, colleagues, students, and friends. On behalf of the Center on Contemporary China and the World, known as the CCCW, CCC+W, welcome to today's event. America's changing strategic assumptions about China, implications for the bilateral relationship. I'm Li Chen, the director of CCCW. It is my privilege to give opening remarks on this critical dialogue, a conversation that could not be more timely given the profound complexities shaping U.S. China relations, arguably the most important bilateral relationship in the present day world. Over the past decade or so, the U.S. and China have navigated a relationship marked by heightened economic and technological rivalry and a strategic mistrust. Yet, even amid these challenges, moments of cautious optimism emerge. Just a couple of weeks ago, President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump met on the sidelines of the APEC summit in Busan, signaling a potential thaw. President Trump's announced visit to China next April underscore a shared, if tentative, commitment to re-engagement. While this summit undoubtedly prevents from the free falls, 垂直坠落 in Chinese, of the bilateral relationship, it is still yet to know its impact on the negative strategic assumptions about China in Washington. These developments not only remind us the great importance of understanding each other's mindset and the strategic thinking, but also point out that diplomacy, however flawed, remains indispensable. Governments alone cannot shoulder this responsibility. This is where institutions like ours play a vital role. In an era where academic collaboration is increasingly politicized and the policy debate grow insular, we should foster people-to-people diplomacy to create spaces for practitioners, professionals, scholars, and students to transcend geopolitical friction through dialogue. Now, it is in this spirit that we turn to our distinguished speaker, David J. Firestein, a dear friend. As the inaugural president and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations, David embodies the bridge between academia and policy, between theory and practice. A decorated diplomat with nearly 2 decades of service, he has navigated the evolution of this relationship firsthand, from its cooperative peaks to the competitive valleys. Now, an academic, acclaimed author, educated at both the University of Texas in Austin and the Tsinghua University, and the architect of Trade 1.5 dialogues of China and regarding U.S.-China relations. He has reshaped policy, particularly to understand the shifting geopolitical politics and also American assumptions over China, regarding China over the past 10 to 15 years. This is also the period that I live in Washington, observe the changes, but still we yet to know how that happened, why it happened. It does not necessarily mean we agree with some of the approach, but that understanding is extremely to this part of the world. And I'm also very proud to add that David is a non-resident senior fellow at the CCCW. And David, really, we are profoundly honored by your engagement with us and truly grateful that you have come all this way to talk to us today. Now, following his keynote, we will transition to a discussion moderated by Zhao Xiuye and the CCCW or Predoctoral Fellow and a PhD candidate at the Tsinghua University. Prior to joining us, Xiuye spent over a decade studying and working in the United States, including many years conducting subnational diplomacy between China and the U.S. Very, very few people have such kind of experience in the frontier in the subnational, particularly state legislature level, to observe the changes. And so we are very lucky to have him at the CCCW. And after that discussion, we will turn to the audience for questions. So get ready. Now, please be aware that today's event is on the record and it's being live streamed on WeChat and YouTube. I just look at the controlling room. There's several hundred people already online. This is 10 minutes ago, I think probably more. We encourage everyone to subscribe to us on this platform for more events like this in the weeks and months to come. So please join me in welcoming David Firestein to the stage for his keynote speech. David.
Okay. Well, Chung, thank you so much for the very generous introduction. I really appreciate it. Molly, thank you for your help just now on the technological issues. Tony, it's great to be with you, and I look forward to our dialogue. It's really a great delight and honor for me to be back in Hong Kong and to be here for my first ever visit to the University of Hong Kong, an incredible institution that produces some amazing talent and really contributes in so many ways, not just to China, but to the region and the world. And it's always great to be with my very dear friend, Chung, who is a living legend in this field, as we know, and whose work I respect very deeply. And thank you so much to all of you for the precious gift of your time. I'm really glad to be with all of you, and I look forward to our conversation. I want to talk about an important and often overlooked aspect of what I regard as the single most consequential bilateral relationship in the world, and let me add, in the history of the world, the U.S. China relationship, and to talk about something that I think is rarely discussed in conferences, speeches, and so on about this really important bilateral relationship. And that is the assumptions that undergird the policy choices that we, for example, in the United States, make with respect to China. When we talk about U.S. China relations, we often talk about policy disagreements, some areas of agreement, some areas of collaboration, more often areas of tension, areas of turbulence, areas of profound disagreement on any number of issues. And so we're talking about policy, we're talking about our nation's positions, our national interests. But too rarely do we really delve into the next level down, which is what are the assumptions that each nation is making that causes that nation or the leadership of that nation to make the policy choices that it makes. And that's the area that I want to delve into today. As a preface to what I want to share this afternoon, I want to share an important observation that I think kind of serves as a backdrop to this entire discussion. And that is that as a general proposition, the efficacy of any public policy is never going to be untethered from the accuracy of the assumptions that undergird that policy, which means that when a country, for example, the United States relative to China, when a country is making accurate assumptions and the assumptions are on the mark, they're reasonable, the likelihood that our policies that are grounded in those assumptions is going to do what we want it to do is fairly high. But if our assumptions are flawed and faulty, off the mark and inaccurate, then the likelihood that the policies that we put in place grounded in those assumptions, that those policies are going to do what we want them to do is very low. And what we see today is that, and I'll go through this in my remarks, is that the fundamental or foundational assumptions that the United States makes about China, the assumptions that inform the policy choices that we make, have radically changed over the last 10 to 15 years. I use the time frame 10 to 15 years for a very specific reason. 15 years ago, the United States was still deeply mired in the financial crisis of 2008 to 2010, and it lasted through 2010. I remember that year, the United States had unemployment at the 10.4% level, which was something that people my age don't even remember the last time. You'd have to go back almost 100 years to the Great Depression to get to levels in the double digits. And it really started to change. The impact of that financial crisis started to have an impact on the way the United States thought about China, framed China, and talked about China. When I say the United States, I mean U.S. officials, candidates for office, people that were in office, presidents, members of Congress, and others. And it had a very significant impact, the financial crisis, on how we looked at China. I say 10 years ago, because 10 years ago, and specifically in March of 2015, a gentleman named Donald Trump announced his candidacy for the presidency and began his presidential campaign. As he came down the escalator and made his presidential aspirations known, he went on, of course, to win the nomination and win the presidency. And he started talking about China in a way that was, as all of us know, very different from anything that we had ever seen before in the United States or in the world. No president, whether Democrat or Republican, had ever spoken about China with the kind of language that Donald Trump as a candidate did, and that Donald Trump as the U.S. president later did after his election. So between 10 and 15 years ago, we started to see a sea change in the foundational assumptions that our country was making about China. And it has had an impact on policy. Now, what I'd like to do in my remarks in the first section is to talk about what I regard as the 7 most important ways that the U.S. assumptions about China and about China's strategic aspirations and strategic intentions, for example, have changed. And I'll go through those briefly. And then on that basis, I want to talk about the impact that it's had on U.S. policy performance. Because my fundamental argument is, as I said, when the assumptions are wrong, the policy is going to veer off course. And when the policy veers off course, we're not going to achieve our own stated objectives. And so I want to lay out my analysis and assessment in these regards. Now, as I talk about the assumptions, I'll use the term we in a general sense. What I mean by that is the United States government, but I really mean both the U.S. executive and legislative branches. And really what I mean is the elected political class, the political establishment, or official Washington. I kind of use those terms interchangeably, but I'm talking about broadly how Washington looks at China. And let me note, as all of us, I think, understand, that what used to be, say, 10 years ago, 7, 8 years ago, a primarily Republican phenomenon has become a bipartisan phenomenon to a large degree in terms of the overall framing of China. So it's no longer just the MAGA Republican Party. It's really the political establishment as a whole. And when I say in the old days, what I mean is earlier than 10 or 15 years ago. And when I say where we are now, I'm talking about the present moment. So with that said, let me go through the 7 major changes and assumptions that we've seen play out over the last 10 to 15 years. The first one is, in the old days, say 20, 25 years ago, we, the United States, assumed that in dealing with China, we were dealing with a partner. Yes, a partner with whom we disagreed on any number of issues, but nevertheless a partner, someone that we could work with, someone that we should work with, and someone that we did, in fact, work with very intensively on a full range of issues. Today, official Washington assumes that as we deal with China, we are dealing with an enemy of the United States of America. That is where most of Washington is in their mindset, or at least it's where they say that they are, whether or not they are authentically expressing their actual beliefs. So from partner to enemy is the first fundamental change in assumptions that we see. And it's a major, and I would say radical departure from where we were. When you frame a country as a partner, or even, for example, as a competitor, or possibly even rival, you're not anticipating the notion of fighting a war with that country. But when you go out of your way to frame a country as the enemy of our nation, then what you're implying, whether you say it explicitly or not, is that there is a real possibility that we could fight a war. So that is the first major assumption, thank you, Chen, that we see shifting. The second major change is that in the old days, we used to assume that engaging China was in the long-term interest of the United States, engaging in all the different ways that we engage, economically, trade, commercially, diplomatically, even militarily, and in various ways dating back again to Richard Nixon, who in 1972 opened the door to a fundamentally transformed U.S. China relationship and to a different chapter in U.S. China relations. And the premise of that opening was that it was in the nation's long-term interest to have a sound relationship with the People's Republic of China. So to engage China was in the long-term interest of our nation. Today, the assumption is that to disengage from China serves the long-term interest of the United States of America. It's exactly the opposite of where we were even 20 years ago or 15 years ago, let alone several decades ago. And this notion of disengagement is manifested in so many different ways. We see it manifested in the incredible restrictiveness around trade, around technology. We see it manifested in the idea of, quote, decoupling, unquote, of moving supply chains away from China and so on. And even doing things like unilaterally suspending the Fulbright program and a host of other things as well. These things would have been unimaginable a few short years ago, but today, official Washington believes that disengaging from China is what serves our interests. The third major change in assumptions is that we as a nation used to assume in the old days that China, while certainly a major player in the world, was nevertheless content to operate in a way that did not fundamentally challenge U.S. primacy or U.S. supremacy as the world's only superpower. So we fundamentally believed that we could do our thing as a nation and China could do its thing, and there wasn't a fundamental conflict of interest between our two nations because we assumed that China had no aspirations to be us. But today, official Washington unquestionably believes across the partisan aisle that China seeks to displace and supplant the United States as the world's only superpower as we, the United States, define the term superpower. That's what people say. And in fact, I think it's what they really think. They think that China wants to become us in exactly the way that we operate in the world. And that is a radical departure from what we assumed a few years ago. The fourth assumption I want to mention is that we used to believe in the United States that China was content to operate as a stakeholder in the international system as we know it. A member of the permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations, a member of pretty much every major organization constituting the global or international architecture, all the trade bodies, all the various other bodies that deal with global affairs, and that China was content to play that major power role within the existing international system. Today, there's no question that official Washington believes, and they say this very explicitly, that China seeks to overturn, overthrow, and completely dismantle the existing international order and to turn it into something that is unrecognizable to any of us today. Presumably with the intention of creating an international order, a new international order that presumably would be more favorable to China and to countries of China's regime type. That's the presumption, that somehow they want to replace the current system with a system that somehow deals China a better hand and is more fair and advantageous to China. So far from being content to operate within the system, China, according to the Washington establishment, now seeks to completely dismantle the system. Now, I have to say on kind of an editorial note here, I find it interesting that this criticism is coming from a country, the United States, this idea that China wants to obliterate the international system, what we call the rules-based international system, that this critique is coming from a nation that is led by a president who says that he wants to annex Canada as the 51st state of the United States of America, wrest the Panama Canal from Panamanian sovereignty, prepare to fight a war with NATO ally Denmark over Greenland, displace Palestinians from Gaza to create an American Riviera on the Mediterranean, and bomb Venezuelan ships at will on the high seas. But no, it's not us. It's China that wants to overturn the rules-based international order. And I do find some irony in that assessment, but that is the assessment that our country is making today. Three others. The fifth assumption that I want to mention is that we used to assume that mutual dependence, and specifically mutual dependence and interdependence between the United States and China, was good and stabilizing, and it worked to the benefit of both nations, our peoples, and the world. Today, the American political establishment clearly believes that mutual dependence is bad, destabilizing, and dangerous for America, because the presumption is that by depending on China to too great a degree, whether it's with respect to rare earth elements, whether it's with respect to supply chains more generally, or other types of economic engagement that we've historically had, that creates an unacceptable level of vulnerability for the United States, and that dependence is bad because of that vulnerability that it generates. And we need to wean ourselves off of that dependence. Now, in the old way of thinking about things, the idea was when two big and powerful countries, and for that matter, nuclear weapon states and so on, were depending on each other and closely integrated, that reduced the likelihood of conflict, because both countries had a stake in the relationship and a stake in stability, and it made kinetic military conflict less likely. But today the mindset is, by depending on China and by having a relationship of mutual dependence, we actually undermine our national security. It's a radical departure from what we used to think. The sixth assumption I want to mention is about the concept of mutual benefit. We used to assume that it was possible for the United States and China to work together at the same time on the same issue, and both come away from that engagement and cooperation having each advanced its interests. In other words, that we could do something together and derive mutual benefit from doing it. We could both win, if I can use that construct, at the same time, something akin to what the Chinese refer to as win-win, the win-win dynamic in U.S. China relations. There's no question that the United States today absolutely rejects that premise, no question. And on the contrary, we now look at China not through the prism of mutual benefit, but through the prism of a zero-sum lens, which by definition means that when China wins, we lose. And when we win, they lose. And given that framing, the US mindset is we need to win and cause China to lose. There is no scenario in the minds of the most important players in Washington where, generally speaking, where we can come away from working together on the same issue and both actually benefit. It becomes a kind of tautology. And it reminds me of the old joke about how do you know when so-and-so is lying? And the answer is when his lips are moving. And to take that and translate that construct into the way Washington looks at China, it's how do you know when China is doing something bad? And the answer in Washington is when China's doing something. When it's doing something, it's bad. And the proof of it is the very fact that China's doing it. And it becomes this perverse tautology that makes it impossible to frame any U.S. China engagement, for the most part, on any issue of consequence as collaborative. And that is a fundamental departure from where we were just a few years ago. And the final point I want to make in terms of assumptions, before I briefly go through what I would call kind of a report card on how our policies are working on the basis of these assumptions, is the idea of, number 7, we used to believe that overall, a suite of moderate policies toward China afforded the United States the best chance of achieving our policy objectives. And that, yes, we had disagreements on a wide range of issues, but overall, we wanted to keep the relationship on the rails. We didn't do anything that was generally too drastic, too dramatic. We valued stability. We valued keeping a certain momentum in the relationship, and we valued moderation in our overall policy approach. That's why both Republican and Democratic presidents and administrations were able to maintain an unusually consistent policy line toward China from Nixon through basically President Obama. Today, it's very clear that the establishment in Washington believes that the best way to advance our interests is through hawkish and hardline policies, things that include cutting off the Fulbright program, talking about 140% tariffs, demonizing China over issues related to COVID-19 and many others, and fundamentally framing China as an enemy, threatening this, threatening that. And it's a very different type of language, but it reflects a very different type of mindset. And it's obviously a very different assumption that we're making. Now, the point I want to make as I transition to briefly going through my assessment of the impact on policy is that there are two things that we can observe about, and that I observe about these 7 changes in assumptions. Number 1, as I've noted, in every case, what we're talking about is a 180-degree shift in what we used to believe. We used to assume A, and now we assume B, and it is in every case exactly the opposite of what we used to assume. And number 2, in my judgment, based on my considered study of the issue and working on these issues for a long time, the one thing that all of the new assumptions that we have today have in common is that they're all dead wrong. Every single one of them. They're all wrong. They're all fundamental misreadings of the situation, of China, of China's aspirations as a nation among nations, of China's strategic intentions. and of the nature of the bilateral relationship. And as a result, the argument that I make is that our policy is veering off course. And I'll talk about that in a second. But it's veering off course because the foundational assumptions that undergird the policy are wrong. And therefore, the resulting policies that stem from that that set of strategic assumptions is wrong, is misguided. Now, as I get into just kind of succinctly going through where we are speaking from an American perspective on policy toward China, I want to point something out that's very important. A lot of people have opinions about U.S. China relations and every other topic under the sun, and it's perfectly appropriate for anyone to have an opinion on any topic. That's great. And I could come up here and I could say to all of you that I think our policies are wrong, and so on. But I'm making a different point in this presentation. I don't want to stand here before you and say that I think that these policies are right or wrong, because to be very honest, I'm nobody special and my views really don't matter. But the metric that I'm using to make an assessment as to whether our policies are succeeding or failing is not what I think about them. The metric I'm using is the only one that actually matters. Are the policies generating the outcomes and the results that the formulators and the implementers of the policies say they want to achieve? That's the metric. That's the metric. Doesn't matter what I think. What matters is if President Trump, or for that matter, President Biden or anyone else says, I want to achieve this, puts in place a set of policies and fails to achieve what he said he wanted to achieve, that is the metric that we're looking at. So with that in mind, let me just briefly go through, and Molly, I am cognizant of the time. I see you back there. Let me just briefly go through and lay out what I think is the evidentiary basis for me saying what I'm saying here today, which is that American policy is failing America. We're failing because we're not achieving our own goals. And if you make a statement like that, I come from the school of thought that says that you need to be able to back that up with an evidentiary basis. I'm going to acknowledge right here, I am old school, and I believe it's important to speak on a factual foundation. And I know that's not necessarily the flavor of the day in the United States and perhaps in some other places. So bear with me for about 4.5 minutes, and you'll see where I'm going with this. Just bear with me. Let's say you're the President of the United States, and you wake up in the morning and you think about China, which any president does and should. You're the President of the United States, you wake up, and among other things, you're thinking about China. So as you think about China, the first thing is you don't want to see a scenario in which you preside over the largest U.S. merchandise trade deficit with China that we've ever had in our nation's history, right? That's not one of your goals for the day or for your administration. You don't want to wake up and find out that you have presided over the largest average annual merchandise deficit for your entire presidency of any presidency in American history. You wouldn't wake up and say, that's something I want to achieve, right? You'd say, it's something I don't want to achieve. You wouldn't wake up and say, I would like to be part of a record-breaking group of presidents or a pair of presidents that preside over the 7 largest U.S. trade deficits with the world that we've ever had in our nation's history, 2017 to 2024, under both President Trump and President Biden. You wouldn't say that's my goal, particularly if you're Trump and you say that eliminating the deficit or drastically reducing it is what you say that you want to do. And you certainly wouldn't want to wake up and hear that China hasn't placed any orders for soybeans in many months and that our soybean sector is collapsing because the largest market is gone because of things that we've done. That would not be a good day if you're president and you're thinking that that's what you're going to learn. You also wouldn't want China to leap ahead at a rapid rate in technology, in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, electric vehicles, advanced robotics, and to gain on the United States incredibly rapidly and surpass us in a number of areas. No president wakes up and says, I hope that China surpasses us in all of these areas. From a human rights standpoint, spoken from an American president's perspective, and recognizing many of my Chinese friends wouldn't agree with some of these assessments, no U.S. president would wake up and say, I really hope that Uyghurs are rounded up and put into camps that they can't leave of their own volition. They wouldn't wake up and say, I hope that what we would call First Amendment rights of expression are rolled back in the great city of Hong Kong owing to the national security law of 2020 and other actions taken. And no president would wake up and say, I really hope that from an American standpoint, the human rights picture in China gets drastically worse than it was before I was president. In terms of regional issues, no president wakes up and says, I hope that China becomes more aggressive toward Taiwan than it ever has been in its entire history. No president wakes up and says, I hope China becomes more belligerent in the South China Sea, pressing its maritime and territorial claims than it ever has been in modern history. And no president wakes up and says, I think it would be a great day if I read an article that says the PLA and the military of China is advancing at record pace in terms of budget and capabilities, rolling out a new aircraft carrier, and developing nuclear weapons capabilities up to nearly 1,000 warheads over the next few years, and building missiles at a rate that we haven't ever seen in the history of the People's Republic of China. Those would be great things that I could report to the American people. Now, no president thinks that way. The last thing I'll say is this. No president wakes up in the morning and looks at the television screen and wants to see Xi Jinping flanked by Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. Of all things, celebrating what? The 80th anniversary of the victory in World War II, when in fact it was the United States in partnership with China that won as allies the war in the Pacific. Soviet Union had nothing to do with it, nor did Korea. And we weren't invited. And President Xi is flanked by Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, and by the way, the Iranian president was in the mix and others as well. No president wants to wake up and see that on the television screen. So here's the punchline, and you saw this coming. No president wants any of those things, but every single one of those things has happened. Every single one of those things is what we have. And it's not what we want. It's not what we want, not because David Firestein says it's not what we want. It's the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, the U.S. Trade Representative, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Commerce, in all of their official statements have stated that in all of the ways that I've just described, according to the Trump administration, according to the Biden administration, that all of these things have gotten worse. They've said it, not me. I'm just the messenger. I'm pointing out that if you read the Pentagon reports and the State Department human rights reports and the Commerce reports and the USTR reports and presidential statements and Truth Social posts, that it's our own leaders who are saying we, the United States, have failed miserably in achieving any of our objectives relative to China. And I'm the skunk at the party who's simply pointing that out. So that leads me to my concluding thoughts. We have to get this relationship right, because the consequences of getting it wrong are far-reaching and very unpleasant. To get this relationship right, we have to understand two truths at the same time. Number one, that China is the single most formidable national competitor that the United States will ever have in the lifetimes of every American drawing breath today. But number two, it is also true that China is an indispensable partner to the United States, whether we like it or not. And both of those things are true at the same time. And the Chinese are able to process that better than we are. And we've got to do a better job of recognizing those essential twin truths and calibrating our policy on the basis of both sides of that equation rather than just one. The U.S. China relationship is going to be strained and challenged for a long time to come. But I think it is possible, if we're smart about it and if we care as we should, to prevent worst case scenarios and perhaps even to get this relationship to a slightly better place than it's been in recent years. What all of us should aspire to is a U.S.-China relationship that is functional, constructive, results-oriented, mutually beneficial, and politically sustainable. If we ground our policies in more thoughtful and accurate assumptions about China's strategic intentions and aspirations, and if we keep our eyes on the long-term national interest of the United States, then I believe we can and we will give our children and our grandchildren the U.S.-China relationship and the future that they deserve. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I will ask Oni or Xiuye to come to the stage. I just want to say a few words. This is a really brilliant talk. And, since I arrived in Hong Kong, I still watch a lot of speeches back in the US. You are the best. And it's a clear, comprehensive, and coherent, and critical. I would say probably the key word is a conceptual or strategic. Allow me to say just a couple of minutes. This reminds me, Dr. Henry Kissinger, your friend, my friend, he told me a few times when I look at the summit, I thought of him. He said, because as we know that the Kissinger met with the Chinese top leaders, 5 generations, had very much involved with Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. And he said that when it's come to the summit, U.S. approach and Chinese approach are fundamentally different. U.S. will talk about the issues, whether it be economic issue, Taiwan issue, human rights issue, Xinjiang issue, or Tibet issue. Chinese will not talk about these issues, not obsessed with these issues. They will see how strategically you perceive us, as you said, as a friend, partner, rival, or enemy that make a huge difference. Now, come to Donald Trump. I think that it's probably fair to say this is the US leader, unprecedented. I also without in the future. He loved to use the term friendship. Talk about China is a friend. Chinese leader is a dear friend, right? So of course, China will not lose that opportunity. I mean, in a way that you talk about 7 assumptions or wrong assumptions, strategic wrong assumptions. Donald Trump is very ironic. I agree with you. He caused a lot of confusion, but also there's a clarity. He said that this should be China, US should be G2. We should get stronger together, right? We should engage with each other. I mean, this all sounds like a departure from the 7 narrative you so sharply identify. I fully agree with you. This is the forces behind the wrong policy. Now, whether we should take it seriously or not seriously, I think it really stimulated that discussion to the next level. So I hope that in your conversation, we talk about Donald Trump, your reading. Of course, China is still a little bit slow to respond to the G2, in my view. They probably would like that concept, but we're hesitant to accept for a number of reasons, because Donald Trump can change very quickly. Yes. And the political atmosphere, as you said, is not so conducive, and the events may hijack the whole thing. But also China worry about whether we alienate, it takes that concept, we alienate European countries, ASEAN countries, not to mention about Russia and many others. And probably most importantly, we talk about governance. But sounds like Donald Trump is not so much interested in G2 as the co-govern or co-evolution with the international system. So with all these things, you touch upon that. So I'm sorry that I interrupted the conversation, but now floor is yours. I want the audience to join me again, give a warm round of applause for your fascinating conversation. Yeah.
Wow, what an amazing crowd.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you all for being with us here today. And thank you, David, for joining such an amazing crowd and your in-depth and insightful speech. My name is Zhao Xiuye, I go by Tony as my English name. I'm a pre-doc here at CCCW. My focus on American politics and U.S. China relations. So it's really my great pleasure to be the moderator today. And moderator, I have the privilege to grill you first, and then we'll open the floor to the audience. So I'm going to start with some big picture questions so that we set the context of the detailed questions further. The first question concerns about the topic of our discussion today, the changing American perception of China. The first time when I saw this topic, the question that came to my mind was, how about the other side of the coin, right? What's the American perspective of the, is there one or are there multiple perceptions of America?
Yeah.
Because, when China has been evolving in the past couple of decades, the United States is also evolving in the past couple of decades. So, and in my opinion, I feel like the China policy or American perception of China is to a certain extent a function of how the United States perceives itself. So as the first question, I would like to get started with that, and then we'll dive into more detailed questions, please.
Yeah, Tony, thank you so much. And Chung, thank you for your comments as well. I really appreciate it. It's a great question, and I think it's a very perceptive question because I would agree with the premise, which is that to a large degree, U.S. perceptions of China probably say more about America than they do about China. And they're really rooted in some internal dynamics within the United States. So I think you're exactly right to put that question on the table. And there's a lot that could be said, but I would say that the thing that comes to mind is that I think the American people have come to question whether the United States is going to be the world's sole superpower for much longer if we stay on the trajectory that we're on as a nation right now. Because the American people are seeing things that we have never seen in the modern history of America or in our nation's history at all. And just as an example, to see tens of thousands of Americans march on our Capitol and attack our Capitol on January 6, 2021, just as one data point, it's something that I think if you'd asked anyone on January 5th, if you would ever see such a thing in your lifetime, nobody would have said that could happen. And yet it did. And the impact that it has is it starts to rattle our confidence that our institutions and our society and our nation, as a nation among nations, is what we thought it was. And some of the norms that have undergirded American life, American political life and social life have been dismantled or are in the process of being dismantled. And I think it's had a negative impact on our nation's confidence as we think about the world and as we think in particular about China as the world's second largest economy and one of the most important technology superpowers that's out there in the world. I think we don't approach the relationship with the same level of confidence that we did before. And as I've often said over the years, when unemployment is at 4% in the United States, China looks one way. But when it was at 10% in the year 2010, China looks very different, and it looks more ominous and scarier. And that's why I said at the outset of my remarks that over the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen some things that have caused us to think differently about us. And as you very rightly note in the premise of your question, it's caused us to think differently about China and to see more sinister intent than we did some years ago. And I think most of it is about us and not a lot of it is about China.
Right. Well, I totally agree with your assessment. I know, you put it in context that right now, U.S. China relations, a lot of times perceived as a win versus lose competition. I would say if one side perceived to be losing, then it will definitely be more hawkish and more defensive against the other side. So I would argue against this rhetoric of win versus lose. Much more complicated than that. Another thing is I noted that in the about 2 weeks ago, the two leaders of the United States and China met in South Korea. And I did notice that President of China, President Xi, mentioned to President Trump saying that, your goal for making America great again is not in conflict with China. I think that's a very, very important and consequential statement to make. So speaking of that, that was a very much anticipated event that happened. President Trump said it was wonderful. It was great conversations. Right. So according to your assessment, 2 weeks after that event, what has and has not changed in China-U.S. relations after that summit?
Well, I think the fundamentals of the relationship haven't changed, and they don't change overnight, and they're not going to change. I mean, as I often have said over the years, on most of the major issues on the U.S. China bilateral agenda, at least as we, the United States, construe that agenda, the sad truth is the United States and China are never, ever going to agree on most of those issues. It's just not going to happen. It doesn't matter how many presidential summits we have or who's in the White House or who the leader of China is at some point in the future. The fact is there are profound and irreconcilable differences of view. And that's the way it is. So that didn't change because of the meeting 2 weeks ago, and it's not going to change in our lifetimes. Whether it's with respect to Taiwan, the validity of China's claims in the South China Sea, human rights, the proper role of a state in managing a domestic economy or international trade, we just don't see these issues the same way. But we can still have a functional and constructive relationship. I think the thing that changed 2 weeks ago was the tonality and the kind of narrative at the presidential messaging level. And that's a good thing. I'm glad that there was a kind of a constructive tonality to the meeting. I'm glad there were a couple of areas where there was some agreement reached. And that's good unto itself. But one of the things I often point out is that we've all seen a pattern in U.S. China relations over the last 9 years, dating back to President Trump taking the oath of office the first time in January of 2017. And that is, the United States will take certain policy actions. For example, will implement massive tariffs on incoming Chinese imports in May of 2018, starting in May of 2018. Will do some damage to the trade relationship. Will generate higher deficits, more unemployment, higher prices for Americans, solve none of the problems, create friction, and create a trade war tonality. And then a little while later, we'll undo some of that and then declare victory and say, isn't that wonderful that we got 10% of the way back to where things were before we started this mess in the first place? And that's what happened in South Korea. We're getting part of the way back to where we were when China did buy soybeans, when we had a lower deficit with China or the world, when we had lower tariffs, when the American people paid lower prices at the grocery store and at various other stores. And we're getting partially back to that. And we're saying this was a 12 out of a 10 super grand slam, home run, whatever metaphor you want to use. It's nonsense. The tonality changed. That's good. The substance is still not in a good place. It's not going to be in a better place until we ground our policies in a better understanding of China and adopt smarter policies that work better for the American people. And when we do that, we'll see better results and the relationship will be better. So I wouldn't understate the importance of getting a tonal shift, but I would definitely not overstate the substantive significance of the meeting for the reasons that I've laid out.
Well, thank you. That was very thoughtful answer to what happened 2 weeks ago. And we'll also stay on high alert on the Truth Social or X post from President Trump on how he perceives the relationship.
Yeah.
It changes rather quickly sometimes.
It does.
So next, I think comes a rather tricky question. We all know you have extensive background, formal diplomacy, and also in people-to-people diplomacy at your current role at the Bush Foundation. So you talked about there are fundamental issues that's not going to change in U.S. China relations. Now, I was also involved in people diplomacy for almost a decade in the United States. I've traveled to state capitals and led state delegations to visit China. Everything went so well. And then I got the question, so what? People ask me that can you stop President Trump from putting tariffs on China by doing people-to-people diplomacy? No. Can you stop Congress from passing hawkish China legislations from doing people-to-people diplomacy? No. So why do you think people-to-people diplomacy is still important? And what do you think are the hurdles that are preventing you from conducting effective people-to-people diplomacy at this point?
Well, it's a great question, Tony. I really appreciate it. And what I would say is I do, having lived in the world of people-to-people diplomacy in the U.S. China relations context for many years when I was a diplomat and subsequent to that, I believe in people-to-people diplomacy. I believe in the Fulbright program. I believe in student exchanges. I believe in sister city relationships. I'll tell you something parenthetically that you may not know. And if you know this after I say it, please raise your hand. And if you don't know it, don't raise your hand. Did you know that Texas, my beloved home state, just passed a law? The legislature passed it. The governor signed it into law on September 1st, and it went into effect on October 1st, banning Texas cities from having any sister city relationships with cities in the People's Republic of China. Did you know that? If you did, raise your hand. Okay, that happened just last month in my state of Texas. It's just wrong. I mean, it's just really misguided, short-sighted, and dumb to cut off those types of relationships when in fact we need more understanding, irrespective of whether you happen to think China is a friend, whether you think it's a partner, whether you think it's a competitor or a rival or an adversary or an enemy. It doesn't matter which of those things you think it is, you need to understand it if you're an American, because there's no single country on the planet Earth that's going to have more impact on the future of our nation, the United States, than China, period. I mean, and we need to be building those bridges. The fact that we currently have maybe 1,000 or even fewer American students studying at college students studying at Chinese universities is astonishing and incredibly disheartening. We should have at least 100 times that number, if not 1,000 times that number. I mean, that's not necessarily realistic, but we need to understand China more today than we ever have in the past. And so I think the Washington mindset about people-to-people diplomacy, which is to restrict, to shut things down, to presume that all communication is only one-sided and unidirectional, and that the only thing that ever happens when Americans meet Chinese is that the Chinese brainwash the Americans to parrot Chinese talking points. They propagandize these, apparently, according to Washington, dumb Americans that don't have any thoughts of their own, and they just get brainwashed by their Chinese interlocutors. It's an absurd and inaccurate framing of what happens in these dialogues. So I do think it's important to sustain the people-to-people dimension of the relationship. And I'll say one last thing on this. It's an important topic. I'm glad you raised it. Some of you may have seen, and Tony, I know you've seen, and I know Chung and Molly and others, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs just published a survey, public opinion survey, about 10 days ago on U.S. sentiment toward China. And to the surprise of many, it indicated that there is now a majority of the American people that favor a friendly and constructive relationship with China. It's the only poll taken in the last 5, 6, or even 10 years that has indicated that there is a majority of Americans that actually want constructive and friendly, even friendly, the F word, friendly relations with China. And I believe that poll is a rebuke, a stinging rebuke to the misguided and ineffectual policies that the United States currently has in place with respect to China. And the American people are saying, we want something better. We want something that works better for us than what we have in place. Higher prices, fewer jobs, less engagement, less business opportunities. People don't want that. So people-to-people diplomacy matters, engagement, advocacy matters, education matters. That's what we stand for at the Bush China Foundation. It's what I stand for. I know it's what CCCW stands for, Chung and Molly, Tony, yourself, and the other members of the team. And we're all fighting the good fight. And we're fighting the good fight for the heart and soul of the United States-China relationship. And it's making a difference. It's making a difference. It's hard to point to a direct causal line, but it's there. And we have to keep making this argument because the future of our country and the future of the world depends on it.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for that very encouraging note. Just a quick follow-up question. There are people in Hong Kong, there are students in Hong Kong, in mainland China that are nervous about going to study in the United States because of this policies on the state and local level, or even from the federal level targeting Chinese students. Would you say that's bottom up or this more politics? I just want to get this message out so that the people in this room or on campus understand the political landscape of studying in the United States.
Yeah, it's a great question, Tony. And I would say that there's no question that in some states more than others, there is an unwelcoming atmosphere at the level of political rhetoric, at the level of some legislation. I mentioned the Texas law that now bans sister cities, of all things, sister cities, and makes it illegal for a Texas city to have a sister city relationship with the PRC city. And indeed, Austin, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio all had to terminate their existing relationships. Texas has also banned Chinese from owning property, real property in most cases in Texas, and there are a host of other things. Other states have done similar things. But at the micro level, as distinct from the macro level, I think it's still possible for students from China to go to the United States, to be welcomed on their campus, to be able to study, to be able to learn, to be treated respectfully and graciously by their fellow students, by professors. And there are a lot of cases of that. That shouldn't get lost. So there's a macro climate that is pretty unwelcoming and pretty cold and not pleasant for someone hailing from China or specifically from Hong Kong to see. But I think in terms of the individual level, micro level experience, it's still possible to have a good experience in the United States. And I'll say something that almost no U.S. politician will say, but they know it's true. We welcome, I welcome, and the Bush China Foundation and the American people welcome Chinese students to come to the United States. We want you, we need you. And the U.S. economy depends in significant measure on having talent from China as well as from many other countries in the world, but disproportionately from China to drive our innovation, to drive our growth, to drive our economic development. And we need to be putting up a welcome sign. And I offer that welcome, at least in my own personal capacity, to all my good friends in China. We need to keep the flow of students going in both directions. And we need even more improvement in terms of getting Americans to China, but we need to continue to open our doors to Chinese students as well.
Good. One quick final question. What's your advice for Hong Kong, since we're in the great city of Hong Kong that's lately caught in geopolitical tensions between the U.S. and China? How do you advise Hong Kong to play its role as a global city internationally? Well,
I mean, Hong Kong is a world level city, one of the great cities in the history of the world, one of the freest economy in the world for many years running, a driver of incredible growth in China and in the region and in the world, and a city that commands a lot of respect across the world and across the United States. And far be it from me to advise Hong Kong per se, except to say, keep doing the things that made Hong Kong great. for all these many years. Be open, be innovative, be free as an economy. It's the most capitalistic free market economy on the planet Earth, according to everyone that looks at rating the economies in terms of their level of economic and market freedom. So the golden goose is something to behold, and I hope it keeps producing golden eggs, and it can and will if you keep doing the things that made this one of the world's greatest cities, one of the greatest cities in the history, in world history.
Thank you, David, for leaving us with encouraging note for Hong Kong. Now we'll have time for questions from the audience. Anybody would like to ask? Yes, Edward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I admire your insight. But it doesn't help you to relieve my discomfort and worry that, as you said, two the biggest economies going on competition. But I see this even more that what the U.S. is going, in fact, beyond obviously, because I've seen it that not just the current president, also during President Biden's time, there's in fact not much difference in the U.S. and China in the last 10 or 15 years you mentioned. Now, and also on the other side, I'm also increasingly worried that China taking the lessons dealing with two successive of the different parties, that perhaps some offensive tactics.
Some offensive tactic is better than sitting there being defensive. And experience tells that, well, some sort of measures to hit on the pain points may get a better reception. Now, in your 7 assumptions, you haven't talked about a factor that is beyond the big two. But I'm a believer that, well, there may not be much prospect for US and China, given this gridlock, could help themselves from easing this tension in the trajectory. Other sort of countries in the world, other allies or otherwise, because I can see there's a major difference in the US policy in the last 10 to 15 years between the two presidents. I think Biden had it conducted in a much more multilateral way. At least US dragged its allies into your camp, AUKUS, Five Eyes, etc. But President Trump seemed to have taken a totally different sort of approach. To what extent do you think the other parties, particularly allies of the US, be they Europe, NATO, or in this part of the world, help to factor, how to sort of come into the equation in easing some of the concern or tension or worry that we both have? Or you think it doesn't matter at all? The US will go about the own way in the time.
Yeah, thank you so much for a really deep and important question. I would say that clearly under this president, there is a tendency to be very willing to just do things unilaterally, often without necessarily even consulting allies or certainly without working with them. As you rightly point out, that was one of the major distinctions between the first Trump administration and the Biden administration. There was certainly a lot of policy continuity between the two administrations where it came to the substance of US policy toward China, but the style was very different, and the multilateralism versus unilateralism was a big feature of that. I think that the United States is going to continue to sort of drive the dynamics in the U.S. China relationship. China has reacted to U.S. policy initiatives, tariffs and restrictiveness around technology and so on. And I think other countries, to one degree, to greater or lesser degrees, take their cue from the United States. In some cases, they view the issues the same way and they sort of fall into line behind the United States or alongside the United States in dealing with China on certain issues. But it's also true that we've seen any number of cases where countries don't see the issue the same way. I remember with respect to the issue of Huawei, for example, there was a time when the United Kingdom of Great Britain saw it very differently than the United States, and they simply took a different position on it. Ultimately, they came around to the United States viewpoint, but there are a lot of areas where Europe looks at things through a different lens, the EU itself, sometimes Japan or Korea and others. So I think we're going to continue to sort of muddle through with the United States, in some ways lurching from one tonality to another, from one policy position to another, with policies changing on the basis of a Truth Social tweet that came out 5 minutes ago, and with others dealing with that and reacting to it as best they can. I don't think there's enough unanimity among the United States and its allies to truly approach China from a unitary policy posture. I think there are differences of perspective, and China is really central to a lot of these economies. And I think the big question mark in the minds of many in the world, including in the United States, is the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again movement that Trump leads and that has dominated American political life for the last 10 years, including when Biden was in office. Is it an aberration, or is it here to stay? And we won't really know the answer to that until the 2028 election results come out. And even then, it may be too early to tell. So I think we're going to just kind of continue to see what we've seen, which is countries dealing with a lot of volatility and unpredictability and managing it as best they can. But I would say most of our allies maybe understand even better than we do how important it is to keep China engaged in the world and engaged in the international system, and not to alienate China to the degree that the U.S. has. No other country has used the rhetoric about China that we have. And just as one final parenthetical point, I would say the biggest failure of U.S. policy, bar none, of the last 10 years, and probably in the history of U.S. policy toward China, is that by alienating China to the degree that we did during the first Trump term, we drove China into Russia's arms to a degree that would have been unthinkable under any other circumstances. But if you look at the way that President Trump and others spoke about China 2017 and especially 2018 through 2021, it caused China to come to the realization that they truly needed a hedge against the United States. And if I can just put it this way, I don't think Russia would have gone into Ukraine if we had handled the China relationship differently. And a lot of other things would be different as well. So here again, we have to look at second and third order effects and impacts of our policies, and we haven't been very good at doing that.
Thanks, David. Next question.
Thanks for your
Close to the mic.
thanks for your insight framework build on this kind of 7 assumptions. Quite interesting. So I'm very curious. Like number one, so with this 7 assumptions, so how about the China? What's in the U.S. whether the China changed the assumptions on the U.S. So I'm very curious.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's something I've thought about. I'm not aware that anyone has yet done the mirror image presentation, which is how have Chinese assumptions about the United States changed in recent, if they've changed, and I think they have changed. And it's something I'm actually thinking about doing myself, but it would be really interesting to sit down with a Chinese counterpart and have that individual, he or she, do a similar analysis. But I do think that some foundational assumptions have shifted. And I think, among those assumptions are, I think China used to think, and I remember being in meetings when I was at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing and having a lot of engagement with the Chinese government and so on. And there was a talking point that was frequently used in the 1990s, the mid-1990s, when I served there for my first tour of duty. And the talking point was stated from a Chinese official perspective. My American friends, you don't have to worry about China overtaking you. It'll be 100 years before we catch up to where you are today in 1996. Well, fast forward to 2025, I don't hear anyone saying that anymore. I think the assumption, and I think it was quite genuine at the time, the assumption was it would essentially take forever, that China would never be able to catch the United States, essentially is what they were saying. Because by the time the 100 years passed, the US would already be that much more advanced. Well, that's not true anymore. And so I think that assumption has shifted. And I think, frankly, the assumption that the United States was that the United States is going to continue to be the world's only superpower with an ability to impose its will on the world, as has generally been the case for the last, since the end of World War II. I think in the 1990s and 20 years ago, China probably presumed that the United States would retain that capacity relative to other nations in the world. And I think China believes today and assumes that actually we are really moving rapidly toward a multipolar world, partly because the United States is not performing. We're not delivering results for the American people, and we're not doing the things and focusing on the things that this is the Chinese perception, one that many Americans would share. We're not doing the things that we need to be doing to maintain our superpower status. I mean, I'll just say one thing with a smile or a chuckle. You know, China spends a lot of time doing work in the areas of artificial intelligence, advanced robotics, quantum computing, quantum physics, biosciences, building aircraft carriers, developing incredible capabilities, electric vehicles, and the list goes on and on. We spend time in the United States on bathroom bills. We spend time in the United States, a huge amount of time, talking about whether men should be able to compete in women's sports, or boys should be able to run in their 5th grade track and field meet at their school if they have transitioned to the female gender. I mean, we're not being serious. We're in a shutdown. We can't pass this year's budget. As I sit here, we haven't passed it. It's been the federal workforce hasn't been paid in 37 days. And many of them haven't been able to work. And China is figuring out what it wants to do in the 22nd century. So, you know, the last thing I'll say on this is, you know, the analogy I use is we in the United States are too focused on China and not focused enough on us. It's like the 100-meter dash, and we're in lane 1 and China's in lane 2, and the gun is up and it's about to go off. And we're sitting there in lane 1, and all we think about is how to make China run slower. But the only thing we can actually control is how to make ourselves run faster. And if we ever focused on that, we would be able to compete with China. But we're not focused on that. We've got to do a better job.
Great answer. I think we probably have time for one last question. Well, yeah, we'll pick somebody, the gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Is it?
We take these 2 questions, and then you will give a combined answer.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Can I go first? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Firestein. It's a very insightful speech. And I find your arguments about the tautology of rhetorics regarding China very intriguing. And, when how do you tell, China is doing things wrong is when China is doing things, right? So my question is that, does that also apply to U.S. domestic politics with respect to China? For example, how do you tell people who are bad? How do you tell bad persons is when people are saying something good about China? That is especially true, I think, among U.S. politics. And would you consider it as one of your concerns that it will end up in a death spiral where people are more afraid or at least less hesitant to say something positive about China, and that will eventually prevent people-to-people exchanges. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The other.
Yeah, I'll turn to that in just a moment.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much for the political overview. Really insightful. My question is a little bit from a different scope. If you connect politics and their relations to educational perspective. So maybe you've heard, maybe not. Recently, Hong Kong universities have invited people who have been rejected from Harvard due to political reasons to get in directly without any admission. And I haven't seen any US institution do that to Chinese students or students from Hong Kong. Do you think people who study, international students from other countries, from diverse backgrounds, from vulnerable communities, who study in Hong Kong or China and who want to pursue their career in the US, have perspectives there more than people who study in the US and want to come back to China or Hong Kong for work? And why is it different? And what do you think people should do? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, okay. Thanks so much. So let me take both questions. Yes, to answer your question, China is a very political topic, very sensitive and charged political topic in the United States. And we're at a point in the United States, and I was the first person in America to use the term neo-McCarthyism or McCarthyism 2.0 in April of 2018 to describe what was happening, I think very accurately, in terms of China discourse. And that is, just as you noted, that if a person articulates a moderate position with respect to China, let alone a position that's regarded as somehow unduly friendly toward China, that person then is subjecting themselves to inevitable attacks from political figures, media figures, and others. There has been a kind of McCarthyist trend line that is reminiscent of the early 1950s, and that there is a kind of orthodoxy that has set in. And anyone that doesn't embrace the orthodoxy, which centers around the idea that China is the enemy of our nation and China seeks to destroy America and usurp our position as the global superpower at our expense. If you don't embrace that, then you're going to take some hits in the United States, as I have often. And it is a race to the bottom in our rhetoric. And the only safe place to be with respect to China discourse, if you're in the political arena or even in the China affairs arena in the think tank community, as I am, or in the academic community, for example, the only safe place to be is to the right of the last person who just talked. So if somebody says, I think China's terrible, let's say someone running for office, then the only way you can acceptably disagree with that person is to say, I disagree. I think China's really terrible. And the only way you can then disagree with that person, if you're the third person on the stage, is to say, no, you're both wrong. China is really, really, really absolutely horrible, not just terrible. And it ratchets the discussion to the extreme fringes of the spectrum of political discourse. You cannot be politically viable by saying, I disagree. Actually, China, the U.S. China relationship, we've got to work together on this. We've got to work together on that. Actually, China's approach to this issue or that issue, climate or whatever, is reasonable. You know, if you say anything like that, you're finished. There's no way in our current moment where you can be elected to any office at any level by taking those positions. So, you know, I'll say one last thing about this before I go to the other question about students. I'll say one thing that may surprise you, but to the American political establishment, this is a conclusion I've come to after many years of working on these issues, including with a lot of people in the political world. not as a politician, but working with people who are in politics in my think tank capacity. To the American political class and to the American political establishment, China is much more valuable as a problem unsolved than it is as a problem solved. The reason for that is threefold. Number one, a candidate can use China as a measuring stick for his or her personal toughness by adopting rhetoric, language, policies, legislation that bashes China, and it establishes their credentials as a tough, macho person. The second thing you can do with the China problems unsolved is you can batter your political opponents over the head for being soft on China. And that routinely occurs even in the primaries, but also in the general elections. It was notable that when Kamala Harris and Donald Trump were running against each other for president, they each criticized each other for being too soft on China. It wasn't a question of, oh, you're too hard and I'm more moderate. It was, I'm tougher than you are. No, I'm tougher than you are. Everybody's trying to position themselves to the right of the last person who spoke. And so you can batter your opponent. But the third and most important reason that we never solve any of these China problems from an American standpoint is because having those problems fester and having China as the big bad boogeyman, the horrible, sinister country that's trying to destroy us, is a really good way to distract the American people from the sad fact that our political class has done a horrible job solving our country's problems. And having the big, bad, horrible, ominous, sinister player out there is a great way to talk about something other than why we haven't been able to solve immigration, education, poverty, gun violence, healthcare, the environment, income inequality, or any other issue you can think of on the national agenda. The $38 trillion national debt, the fact that we can't pass a budget, and so forth and so on. So it's the oldest trick in the book, as all of us know, is blame the foreign bad guy, the baddie. In that way, you take the heat off of yourself for the fact that you've failed to achieve what the American people elected you to achieve. For those reasons, politicking China is the smart way to go. The only problem is good politics generally don't translate into good policy. And that's why we're failing to achieve our own goals. Final point on your question, I suspect there is an opportunity for students that study here at Hong Kong, University of Hong Kong University, or other great institutions here in Hong Kong or in China, mainland China, Tsinghua, Beida, and many others, to go and have incredible success academically and professionally in the United States. I've seen that many times over. It's a tough environment now, but I think those channels are still there. I hope that they're still there in reverse as well. I hope that Americans can study in the United States, come over here, and then find ways to develop professionally. I think the language issue creates a bit more of a barrier for the Americans coming here than it does for Chinese going to the United States, because there aren't nearly as many Americans that have the professional level fluency in Chinese as there are vice versa. So my hope is that the doors remain open, and that whether one thinks of China as a friend, as a competitor, or as an enemy, God forbid, that we all understand we need to understand each other. We've got to do a better job. And the future of both of our countries, both of our peoples, and the world absolutely depend on it. And that's why we're going to try to continue doing what we do at the Bush China Foundation. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I understand that time is limited. I will be very brief. First of all, thank you all for participating in this event. I certainly learned a great deal. I hope that you feel the same. And I also want to thank the CCCW team, especially Molly, and also many in the controlling room for the live stream and also for the logistic support. And thank Tony for really moderating this great conversation. But last, certainly not the least, I want to thank David for the brilliant talk. You and I spend most of our career to understand China, to study China. and you are as the diplomat, as a foundation head, and especially when you work for East and West Center for many years. So for me, as a professor and also think tank scholar, now increasingly we also feel understand the U.S. become very, very important. So I particularly intrigued by your comment because it's not equal. U.S. is far more active. China has been relatively passive. U.S. is an existing power, probably feel more fearful with the rising power. And the U.S. used to be very, very confident, but as we know in recent years, become lack of confidence. These will explain the current situation. So I think it's extremely important to understand the United States, not so much about demonize America. This is not in your talk, in my work, but just understand the deep forces, the sentiment, the mindset, or the strategic or lack of strategic thinking in the U.S. I think it's very, very important. Now, what you said is particularly inspiring, and from America to look at its own problem, right, American. So I think that I wanted to end with a gift. It's not a panda, but a lion. Lion is lucky animal of Hong Kong and the Hong Kong U. I think it symbolizes courage, compassion, confidence. You all represent. I hope that particularly this talk, I hope you will come back to share our study of China, our study of the US. I also particularly want to emphasize, I absolutely agree with you, it's not a zero-sum game. And also, I noticed that in President Xi Jinping and Donald Trump's conversation, they talk about same boat. So I think we're in the same boat. So with that, I wanted to send it.